women throughout many, many centuries have not had a good place where we can be heard and our voices listened to. Without the vote, our voices are silenced.
Suffrage is the right to vote. It's the privilege to vote. It's also the opportunity to vote.
We often think about suffrage as being this inevitable thing. Of course, women have the right to vote. Today, we barely think twice when we see a woman casting a ballot. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, that seemed like the end of the world.
Women cannot vote anywhere. Any sort of Western Republican democracy does not have rights for women.
The suffrage story, if it's told at all, it usually has one sentence. Women met at Seneca Falls in 1848, fast forward, and in 1920 they were given the vote. That's not how it happened.
We're so focused on the federal amendment, we forget that the story of the states was its own history.
Earlier than that, 50 years earlier, it was in the West that it happened first. The battle for suffrage had already taken place in the territory of Wyoming.
Major funding for the State of Equality was provided by grants from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, Because Culture Matters, a program of the Wyoming Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources, culturaltrust.wyo.gov, and the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities. thinkwhy.org. And by the Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, the philanthropic arm of Rocky Mountain Power, supporting the growth and vitality of our communities. And the Homer A. and Mildred S. Scott Foundation, working to strengthen the lives of people who in turn make our community a great place to live. And by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment.
Wyoming used to be the place to go through, not a place to go to. Up until 1840, when you started having movement into the Oregon Territory, there was no reason to come out here.
There were certain dynamics that were starting to come together, which indicated that the breakthrough for women's suffrage was probably going to occur in a territory, someplace out west.
A lot of towns in Wyoming exist with families and women because on the way west, someone saw a tree and some water and said, I'm not going another step. I think by the time you get to places like South Pass, which is the way over into Oregon and California, people did say, I'm staying here. And then, of course, they found gold.
That was 1867, 1868. The rumors of gold at South Pass brought hundreds and eventually thousands of people into this area.
The people that first started populating South Pass, typical miners, young, single men, married men who had left their wives and families behind to try to go ahead and make their fortune.
It's the merchants, the bankers, maybe some of the freighters and service industries, washers, cooks, this kind of thing, the hotel industry. They might bring their families. The wife and the children could participate in building the family's fortune through simple housekeeping, laundry, and guest keeping. Community-minded individuals wanted to at least act the part of a community that would endure. And one of those discussions, at least here, was women's suffrage.
When you get people like Esther Morris and her family coming here, that's a shift in attitude about what people do here. They intended to come and stay. They intended to settle.
Esther Hobart Morris was born in upstate New York, where the suffrage movement begins. She's an active, vocal woman. She's got connections to the suffrage movement. She remains unmarried until she's almost 30, which is a little unusual in her times. She had a child, and then her husband died very soon afterwards. Her husband owned a piece of property in Illinois, so she decided to head out to claim that piece of property. In that era, the laws are not in favor of widowed women in terms of property rights. She had difficulties claiming it and took the easier route, which was to get remarried to a man named John Morris.
He heard about gold being discovered in South Pass, and so he decided to move out here, and she was willing to follow him out here.
I can't even think of how it would be then as a woman. For women's issues, women's health issues, if you didn't have another woman to help, you were lost. I can't imagine how terrifying that would be. These were very strong women. Women so put down for so many years. Here is where the change starts that, women are important and we have to not take them for granted.
The Union Pacific Railroad was working its way out of the Nebraska Territory into the western part of the Dakota Territory. July 25th, 1868, the Wyoming Territory is formed. South Pass was a lot like many other towns in the Wyoming Territory at that time. There was such a great turnover and transition in the towns that you tended to vote for people that you knew. That was the principle that applied when it came down to electing the first legislators to go to Cheyenne and set up the laws for the territory. South Pass City, at its height, had over 20 saloons operating up here for a town of maybe 1,000 or two. William Brite, a ex-Southerner who was also a Union soldier, was here in South Pass City. William and his wife, Julia, were instrumental in the passage of the women's suffrage bill.
So William Brite started a saloon. It kind of fits into the story of him having some political ambitions.
If you look at the papers in South Pass City in the months before the election, there's an enormous amount of anti-Black sentiment, and particularly anti-Black suffrage sentiment.
The Democrats at the time were the ones who were very opposed to civil rights for African Americans, for Native Americans, Chinese, people of color. They were not as much pro-women's rights as they were anti-Black vote, anti-Chinese vote, anti-other vote. What's the process? You put out a flyer and you say, anyone who's opposed to all these idiotic reforms that those Republicans have passed, come on, let's have a beer and let's talk about it and let's get our people elected. And it was very successful.
William Brite himself had chaired a meeting which protested Black men being given the right to vote. So this is something that's in the air in South Pass City.
The Blacks who came to South Pass worked in a variety of occupations. Some of them were miners, but most of them were laborers, say for a livery stable or helping out in a saloon. Congress passed a law giving African American males the right to vote in the territories. And the first time that came into play here was in 1869. And there was a threat of violence as a result of the recalcitrant Democrats. They were vowing that they would not allow the African American residents of South Pass City to vote.
At our first election, before women voted, we had pandemonium. The saloons were all open. Whiskey was dealt out freely by the candidates to all who would vote for them. The streets were filled with men partially intoxicated, all armed with knives and pistols.
The territorial sheriff got wind of that, and he rode up here, and he rode in front of the group of Blacks to vote, and made sure that they had the ability to vote, and essentially stared down that group of miners. One of the questions that has vexed historians since the passage of the women's suffrage bill is what motivated William Brite to introduce it. He didn't talk to suffragettes in South Pass City, and he had no history with regard to promoting women's suffrage bills. So who influenced him?
One, if we're going to let former slaves vote, why can't we let our wives and daughters and sisters vote? That was logic to a man born in Virginia. And I think the second argument was, my wife is smart and she thinks it's the right thing to do, and I will do it.
Julia Brite is a fairly unknown person, perfect Victorian woman. No one knows about her. Her name comes up only when she is born, gets married, has a baby, or dies. And yet she's credited as being the more educated, the brightest of the Brites, and encouraging her husband to support suffrage.
Like any territory, Wyoming was interested in statehood the day it became a territory. There was so many more benefits of living in a state as opposed to a territory. Who you could vote for, what you can control, how much money would flow into the state or versus a territory, both from the federal government as well as from corporations.
Wyoming lacked a couple of important components. The most important one was the thought that Wyoming didn't have the 60,000 people that would be required in order to qualify for statehood.
It was on the minds of some of the folks who got together there in Cheyenne in the fall of 1869 to organize Wyoming as a possibility of being the first place to offer women the right to vote. And not only the notoriety and the publicity that would come with it, but also the understanding that if it brought more women to the Wyoming Territory, it would bring more children, it would bring more husbands, it would bring more of the community builders out here to their territory.
Why did suffrage come to the West? There are, I think, several answers to it. Was it just frivolous? Was it really pragmatic in terms of how do we boost our population? Was there a racist element to it? You know, we'll never know the full story. But that is a fuller story than simply, we're Wyoming, we're great, everybody's equal.
The difficulty is how we bridge these two important movements. What was happening with Western suffragists and what was happening at the national level.
The women we know as the foremothers, so to speak, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, are all abolition workers before they worked for suffrage. So the women's rights movement, of which suffrage is one part, really comes out of the abolition movement. These are twin movements up and through the Civil War.
People often date this to 1848, which is when there was a women's rights convention, the very first one in the US, held in Seneca Falls, New York. It was a local impromptu convention, so it didn't draw widely, but people often point to this as one of the first demands for the vote. New research is showing that, in fact, the temperance women were demanding the right to vote before the abolitionist women in 1846. So this narrative still has a lot of things to be uncovered. There also are a whole host of other issues.
Providing greater access or equal access to a university education, to education in general, to be able to have custody of their children when it came down to divorces, and also the ability to inherit property.
Women's access to the professions, an end to the sexual double standard, women's equal pay, women's dress reform, all kinds of different things.
For many, it was really a domestic violence issue. When women could not bring suit, when women could not divorce their husbands, when women couldn't testify in a court of law. If she had an abusive husband or an abusive father, there was nothing she could do.
When a man and a woman got married, she disappeared or became covered under his authority. And so there was one political voice for the family, and it would be his.
Prior to the Civil War, everyone had looked to the states. There's a big shift after the war where people start looking to the federal government for voting.
Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law.
If the 14th Amendment guaranteed the rights of all citizens, then suffragists argued that all citizens had the right to vote. And so that's why in 1872, women cast ballots in the presidential election, including Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and many other suffragists. And their idea was that they wanted to prompt the court system to basically bring them to trial. This came up to the Supreme Court of the United States. They decided that having the right to vote is not a right of citizenship.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
The 15th Amendment really split the women's rights movement down the middle. Civil rights activists decided that they were going to prioritize African American men's votes. And Frederick Douglass said something along the lines of, until women are also, dragged to the streets and violently attacked the way Black men are, then Black men in particular need to have the right to vote first.
The two most famously who oppose it, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they oppose it on explicitly racist grounds, that this would elevate ignorant Black manhood over dignified white womanhood. They start to argue that what we need is a new constitutional amendment, the 16th Amendment, that will bar discrimination on the basis of sex, which they hadn't been able to get inserted into the 15th Amendment. A whole host of other suffragists say no, the 15th Amendment was an emergency measure and that the states still control voting. And if we want to win the right to vote, we have to do it state by state by state. People are clear this is going to be a very long fight.
One would expect that New York would be the first state to pass suffrage. That's where the Seneca Falls Convention happened. But in order to get suffrage as a law, you would have to have petitions go out throughout the state. You'd have to go into special legislative session, 2/3 majority. The governor would have to sign it, and then you'd have to have a special election afterwards. It's a lot of work and a lot of possibilities along the way where it would get sabotaged. The suffrage movement knew that the best chance for suffrage law to pass would be here in the territories. In Wyoming, what'd you have? 14, 15 guys voted, it was a majority, and the governor signed it.
It's absolutely true. The West is far more progressive when it comes to giving women the vote.
In those days, territorial officers were appointed by the president and came into Wyoming territory without ever having stepped foot in the place before their appointment. John A. Campbell, in fact, his first arrival in Wyoming in 1869 happened just a few weeks before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And he got off the train over in Cheyenne and took a look around and said, well, this is as good a place as any for my temporary capital.
Cheyenne was a rough and tumble place the first 2 years. Buildings began to be built, and once they become more permanent, why then people start staying. There were women and children coming. They needed churches. They needed schools. And the legislature began its operation in 1869.
These were average individuals who were elected to go to the legislature. Little experience, all Democrats. And William Brite was one of the folks who won the race, and his fellow councilmen elected him as the president of the council, a really important position.
Governor John A. Campbell was a Republican. He had been a longtime supporter of women's suffrage back in his home state of Ohio. His territorial secretary, a guy by the name of Edward M. Lee, was even closer affiliated with the suffrage movement because he had been a member of the Connecticut legislature and had been on the losing side of an effort to gain women's suffrage in Connecticut. Here he is in Wyoming as the territorial secretary and having a very real opportunity to help influence that very important piece of legislation. The territorial citizens would have known about what was going on back east because not only was there back and forth traffic, but there was telegraphic communication going on all the time. And Wyoming had some daily newspapers. They were pretty well plugged into what was going on elsewhere in the world.
There were a couple of women suffragettes who had come through Cheyenne about that time.
Anna Dickinson happened to pass through Cheyenne just about the time that the first territorial legislature met, and she gave a talk. And that talk was instrumental in convincing some of the legislatures about the importance of women's right to vote.
The second suffragette who came through was Redelia Bates. William Brite and other legislators heard about that, and so they invited her to speak to the legislature. The fact that Redelia Bates was asked to address the legislature was rare, if not unique.
This was a legislative assembly that was really thinking about women and equal rights in much broader terms than one might expect. They passed some bills that gave women rights that were ahead of the times. One of them was equal pay for teachers. Women were able to hold and control property.
And it was towards the end of the session, William Brite introduced the suffrage bill. And it was the only bill that he introduced during the entire session.
One of the interesting things about the passage of the suffrage bill is there's some chaos in the House. It passes the council, but in the House there's some debate about it.
The debate lasted 2 or 3 days. It was dramatic. Folks did not know if it was going to pass or not. Benjamin Sheeks from South Pass was a strong opponent of the bill.
Sheeks was just reflecting a very, very common view for men and women, that women don't belong in politics, that voting was transgressing their role in the domestic sphere and getting into that nasty, icky world of public policy and politics. He wanted an amendment that Black women and Native women could vote to because he figured that would derail it. Or that he would change the ages that women could vote from 18 to 21. And that actually did pass. Or that they'd change the language from women to ladies, why?
The territorial legislature consisted of no one who had ever served in a legislature before. These young rookies took a look around and said, well, gee, if the territorial governor's in favor of it, Edward M. Lee, the territorial secretary, is in favor of it, and William Brite is in favor of it, and they're both Republicans and Democrats involved, there must not be anything too bad about supporting suffrage.
You have this nexus of pioneer spirit. I think it's some of that women were considered partners in forging the civilization in what was considered wilderness.
The idea is that, yes, women should be able to vote. Yes, we should be able to counter the votes that were granted to African American men. Let's make this happen here.
Others over time have alleged that it was a joke, that legislators were just having a bit of fun towards the end of the session, and that it wasn't going to go anywhere.
What about principle? Are there times when individuals have the opportunity to come together and do something significant because of what they believe in?
I think, the old adage that sometimes you do the right thing for the wrong reasons is part of how Wyoming women got the right to vote.
Governor Campbell yesterday approved the female suffrage bill, thus making it a law of the territory. We now expect at once quite an immigration of ladies to Wyoming. We say to them all, come on, There is room for a great many here yet.
You can see in the newspapers at Cheyenne that Wyoming is kind of looking for ways to distinguish itself.
Whichever territory passed it first would more than likely get more notoriety. The more notoriety you get, the better chance you have of showing up on the front page of the New York newspapers, then the better chance you had, perhaps, of attracting the women.
Nebraska, which then had two chambers, one had passed women's suffrage in 1856, if one can believe it. And in 1869, earlier in the year, the Dakota legislature failed by one vote to do it.
Wyoming was the first state to unconditionally grant and recognize the right to vote. We always use the word grant, and we're trying to get away from that. This is an inherent right that women have always had. Wyoming was just the first state to finally recognize it.
I think it was the Cheyenne leader that said, "It is better to appear to be in the lead than to hinder a movement that is inevitable."
Once suffrage is passed, the governor who signs the bill is John Campbell. He goes home for Christmas, and he leaves Edward Lee in charge. And then I think he knows that we can pass a law, but that's not going to change anything unless we follow that up with some action. He offers Justice of the Peace position to Esther Morris.
Newspapers like the Revolution and the Women's Journal reported when Esther Morris became the first Justice of the Peace because it was a really transformative moment and people were very proud of these women's rights achievements.
She stood 6 feet tall, and she certainly had an omnipresent way of being.
She functioned in a tough environment, and her first act as a judge was to order her predecessor to give her the docket book because he wouldn't give it to her so she could do her job. So that tells you she maybe didn't walk into the open arms of people, being very excited about there being a woman judge.
Circumstances have transpired to make my position as a Justice of the Peace a test of woman's ability to hold public office, and I feel that my work has been satisfactory. Although I have often regretted I was not better qualified to fill the position. Like all pioneers, I have labored more in faith and hope.
She does participate in a certain amount of political activism, for sure. And she's well known, and there is a spotlight on her, to a greater or lesser degree for the rest of her life.
Esther Hobart Morris was the first woman in the country to be appointed as a judge, and that is something that we celebrate. But it is important to recognize, and it's a little bit of a sad fact, that it took us another 111 years to have a woman appointed as a statewide district court judge.
Mrs. Louisa A. Swain, a lady 70 years of age, walked up and deposited her vote. It being the first here, and probably the first ever deposited in the world by a lady at a general election. Mrs. Swain is an old lady of the highest social standing in our community, universally beloved.
You had to be brave to stand up and stand in that line at the polling place in Cheyenne, wherever you were, and say, okay, I'm going to assert my rights. Your pastor may not have approved of it. Your sewing circle may not have approved of it. Your family might not approve of it.
Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper publishes this very positive image of women voting. Nothing is awry. There aren't women, running through the streets looking manly. Suffragists really circulated these images regularly, that these women would vote in an orderly way, that they were wearing dresses and that they were not going to start, all wearing bloomers suddenly and abandon their children.
Lots of women voted before Wyoming women. So in New Jersey, from the time of New Jersey's Constitution until 1807, some women who owned property could vote. In Kentucky and Michigan, they had school suffrage laws. They were maybe a widow and didn't have a husband to vote for them. They were allowed to vote in those kinds of elections.
Utah held a general election on the 1st of August, 1870. And the newspapers in Utah said that 2,000 women voted in that particular general election. But in 1887, when Utah was asking to enter into the United States as a state, the U.S. Congress said you have to rescind polygamy and you have to take away the right for women to vote.
Getting a right passed in the law does not necessarily mean that you're going to be able to keep that right. But in Wyoming, we keep the right, and as far as anybody can tell, women actually utilize it and use it and are not prevented from exercising it. And I think that that speaks a lot to the value that people do actually place on women's suffrage.
Women voted. Perfect order prevailed, and has prevailed ever since. Carriages were employed by the candidates to bring ladies to the polls.
In 1869, there had been violence at the polls when Black men attempted to vote in South Pass City. So I think Black women voting in 1870 is really important.
At the hotel were a number of colored girls employed as servants. After a while, a carriage drove up with 4 of these colored girls in it. They were helped out. As they went to the polls, the crowd quietly parted. They voted and returned to the carriage without a word said. Then I breathed freely. I knew all was safe.
The suffrage law states that every woman of the age of 21 years residing in this territory may, at every election, to be holden under the laws thereof to cast her vote. And yet it's unclear if this included Native American women.
Just a year prior, the United States government had entered into 2 significant treaties with Native people in Wyoming. And so really the thinking back then was that Native people were distinct entities, sovereign nations, and they weren't really integrated into non-Indian society.
They still were suppressed. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't welcome to vote. They were intimidated. It was so hard back in that time for Indigenous women to be thinking about even voting. It was just surviving.
Many Native Americans did not necessarily pursue voting rights because it meant that their tribal sovereignty would be ended. And so to become citizens of and to become voters in the United States was to lose their tribal sovereignty and lose their autonomy.
Native Americans as a whole could not vote in this country until 1924, when Congress passed an act that permitted all the Native Americans to attain citizenship. They left it up to the states to determine what Native Americans within their jurisdiction could indeed vote. And states dragged their feet. So it wasn't until the late 1960s when, in reality, you could say that all Native Americans in the country could vote.
In the next legislative session, the subject of suffrage became politicized in a way that it hadn't been before.
Between the first legislature and the convening 2 years later of the next territorial legislature, only one guy remained from the previous session.
William Brite's various speculative ventures didn't pay off, and they moved to Colorado. He and Julia became involved in the women's suffrage attempt down in Colorado legislature. Further indication that William Brite sincerely believed in women's suffrage, at least for white women.
In the 1870 election, there were some Republicans that slid under the door. How did this happen? It must be the women.
Wyoming didn't have a secret ballot until 1890. Therefore, it was observed that in Laramie, it seemed to him that most of the women voted for the Republican delegate to Congress. So the Democrats were mad about that.
This time the repeal started in the House. Women were much more visible in the effort to forestall repeal than they were in 1869. By 1871, the women's movement was becoming more closely identified with prohibition. And that was problematic because an awful lot of legislators and leadership in Wyoming owned saloons or had some kind of connection to them. The legislature that had given women the right to vote in '69, in 1871, repealed it.
Governor John A. Campbell held the same principle that he had expressed 2 years earlier. Campbell vetoed the repeal. When the bill went back to the legislature to try to override, it narrowly escaped.
Wyoming, from her rocky eyrie, sends greeting to the aged sister states and invites them to come up higher, to stand with her upon the skirmish lines of civilization. The genius of liberty is on picket duty in Wyoming.
Some states that were still denying women the right and the ability to vote and hold office, the arguments were somehow their voice or participation in suffrage would weaken rights or dismantle government. That wasn't the case at all. So we really disproved a lot of myths that people used to prevent women from participating in government.
Wyoming gave women the right to vote, and the world didn't end. Well, I think the nation took notice of it, especially the women's suffrage movement.
Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton come visit Wyoming, and they come visit Utah. And then actually Anthony spends several months touring the West. She tried on the federal level and had not been able to secure suffrage for women. So I think she sees opportunity in the West.
Wyoming is the first domino to fall. Utah will follow very quickly in their territorial constitution and enfranchise women. And then a whole host of other states will start to fall.
There's a lot of women who take advantage of the opportunity to run for office on a local level. After that, in pretty much every election, you always have women candidates running for a variety of offices. So you see women running for county clerk, you see women running for justice of the peace, but more commonly you see women running for county superintendent of instruction, and they've won elections to be in those positions. By the time you get to statehood, you've got about 80% of the county superintendents in the state are women.
When Brite introduced his bill, it included not only suffrage, but the ability to hold office and to participate fully in civic life. And so this included the right to be on a jury, as it was interpreted by the first judge, Judge Howe.
There are two stories about why women were included on that first jury. The first story was they felt if they put women in the jury box and they did a really bad job, that then it would be easier to repeal the 1869 Suffrage Act. Justice Howe said the reason that the women were put in the jury box is because in the prior session of court, men weren't paying attention to the proceedings and they were reluctant to convict their friends.
A new judge comes in who's from the South, and he says, I don't think so.
And he did that because on December the 7th, 3 days before the Suffrage Act was passed, Wyoming had enacted a law that only men could sit on juries. Women never served on a jury again in Wyoming until 1950.
And you can say, well, it's those darn guys putting women back in their little domestic sphere. But you have to recognize that there were a lot of women who were against women serving on juries or being active any way outside of the domestic sphere, who were against suffrage. Women's role as morally superior beings was to influence husbands, brothers, sons. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world.
It was 1874. The Grant administration was considering asking Congress to dissolve the Wyoming Territory because so few people lived out here. And Wyoming's representative to Congress went in to talk to Grant. And he finished off his argument by saying that Wyoming was a wonderful place to live. And the only thing that Wyoming needed was some water and a few good people. And Grant's reply was, you could say the same thing about hell.
For 12 years, there wasn't much activity with respect to admitting a new state to the Union. Finally, that all broke loose in 1888 with the election of Benjamin Harrison to the presidency. It was seen that the Congress and the president were amenable to adding new states. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington all leaped in and asked Congress for the authority to call a constitutional convention.
The quickest way to get from point A to point B and become a state is to copy most of the Constitution that Washington and other territories had already submitted and had been approved. So there's not a lot of originality in the Wyoming Constitution, with two exceptions. One has to do with water rights, and the second one has to do with women's suffrage.
it took place in this room where they deliberated and talked about it, and then they go out on the front steps of this Capitol and take a picture, and there are 4 or 5 women in the picture that were, there advising and talking and probably saying, you should, in between coffee breaks. Lobbyists, they were probably the first lobbyists in Wyoming.
Wyoming was going to become the first territory to submit a constitution to Congress in which women could vote. And everyone knew that that would be controversial. And the concern with some of the delegates was that Congress may turn down the application to become a state because of that. As a result, about a third of the way through the Constitutional Convention, a Cheyenne delegate stood up and made a motion to separate women's suffrage from the rest of the proposed Constitution and asked the people of Wyoming to vote on it separately.
My great-grandmother, Teresa Alberta Parkinson Jenkins, went all around the city of Cheyenne to tell all of the women that they needed to get down to the convention and stop this amendment from going through. And so the women all did. She did not get to go to the convention because she went into labor, and she went home, and she that evening delivered a baby.
Senator Joseph Carey sends a telegram and says, Wyoming may not make it into the Union with women having the vote.
Wyoming, via telegram, responded to Congress saying we would rather stay out of the Union 100 years than to come in without our women.
The Wyoming application was approved by Congress and signed by the President. And when it did, Wyoming became the first state to allow women the right to vote.
The rights of the citizens of the state of Wyoming to vote and hold office shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. Both male and female citizens of this state shall equally enjoy all civil, political, and religious rights and privileges.
The Wyoming Constitution is explicit that there shall be no discrimination based upon gender. The U.S. Constitution does not include that explicit statement. The right to vote is where it starts, but it certainly isn't where it ends.
The laws of this state affecting the political rights and privileges of its citizens shall be without distinction of race, color, sex, or any circumstance or condition whatsoever, other than individual incompetency.
It's much more broad and all-inclusive as to the rights of individuals being equal, gender, race, color, whatever. And I've always been proud of that fact.
Teresa Jenkins speaks at the statehood celebration. She participated in at least 12 suffrage campaigns across the West. She's able to present herself at these campaigns as, I am a woman Wyoming voter. And this is what a voter looks like. And guess what? It looks like everybody else.
Man has no right to expect woman to take up issues that he ignores.
Nor has he any right to withhold the suffrage for fear she will do so. But woman is asking for the ballot and ought to say to a man, we will make better use of it than you have. This is the ground on which we must demand the suffrage, to raise politics out of its filthiness, corruption, and ignorance,
and to bring in the reign of purity, patriotism, and intelligence.
The passage of suffrage in Western states, including Wyoming, but also Washington, Utah, California in the late 19th and early 20th century, proved really useful when suffragists were creating propaganda. One of the most famous of these was in Puck, and it's called The Awakening, and it features a Lady Justice figure marching from the West Coast to the East Coast. Women are reaching out, trying to grab her, trying to bring her over.
There's all kinds of banners and posters saying, Wyoming did it, why can't Pennsylvania? And yet it's also used as a cautionary tale. The anti-suffragists go and try to get vox pop in the various Western states to say, ain't working so well here for us.
The suffragettes were very careful about how they portrayed themselves. They were very careful to moderate their voices so they wouldn't be that shrill, shrieking woman. They were careful to dress very modestly so that they presented themselves as demure, intelligent, middle-class women. And the more attractive they were, the better it was. And I'll ask you now, how has it changed?
From the sort of 1910s to say 1918, a whole bunch of Western states are voting. So a lot of states, really populous states, start to get the right to vote for women. And were it not for those voting women at the state level who are putting pressure on governors and on legislators and on politicians, it's not clear that we would have gotten that federal amendment.
American suffragists start thinking about public spectacles. The first national parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913 was a moment when the national spotlight was really focused on the suffrage movement.
They launched this massive suffrage parade to upstage Wilson's inauguration. They asked African-American women to march in segregated delegations. Many African-American women were not willing to concede that kind of Jim Crow application to the suffrage movement. The most famous one being Ida B. Wells, who was really one of the most important civil rights activists in the 19th and early 20th century. Anti-lynching activist, voting rights activist, journalist, teacher. She slipped in with the white women and marched with them.
Riots break out at the parade against these parading women, and eventually the cavalry actually has to get called in.
The Wyoming suffrage bill that provided women the ability to vote also gave them the right to hold office. It was very clear. But the first woman legislator wasn't elected until almost 50 years later.
Mary Bellamy. She came here as a preteen with her widowed mother, came to Wyoming to start a new life. Think about this. You've got a 20-year-old who decided to run for office and she lost. And she turned around again and she ran again and she won. And what that took to say, I have something to offer, my voice needs to be heard.
This is actually, I think, a good example of how women are making political progress in this era. She serves in the 1911 session. That kind of makes her nationally prominent. She knows all of the big national suffragists. She's hanging out in their homes. She's corresponding with them. A voting woman who can speak to what it's like to live in a suffrage state.
They found out at work that women could vote. They could hold office. They could still maintain the things at home.
By the summer of 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for over 7 decades. And this becomes the moment when it may be possible.
Wyoming was the 27th state in ratifying the 19th Amendment.
The Western states are actually quite slow to ratify. The governors basically say, well, our women can vote, why should we go to the bother? There's political risks calling a special election because most of the state legislatures were not in session in 1920. They were usually on a biannual session schedule. Wyoming governor, for instance, says it's going to be expensive. And Carrie Catt and the suffragists of Wyoming say, don't worry, we will serve as secretaries and pages and transcribers and chauffeurs, and you won't have to pay for any staff. We'll do it all. And that's how they finally kind of shame the governor into allowing ratification. 35 states have ratified. They need 36 of the 48 states in the Union. And they feel that if they can't get Tennessee, so if it fails to ratify, the amendment won't be ratified for the foreseeable future. There's one young man, the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, 24-year-old Harry Byrne. He should vote against it if he knows what's good for him politically. That morning, he had received a letter from his mother, very much a mom letter. Please pick up some, supplies when you're in the big city. Get me some sheet music for my piano. And then she says, be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt ratify. He later explains that made a difference, that it's always wise for a boy to listen to his mother. This is a moment when personal decision becomes history.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
Nellie Taylor Ross became the first woman elected governor in the United States in 1924.
A month before, her husband had passed away suddenly halfway through his term. The Democrats decided to nominate Governor Ross's wife, Nellie.
But to be an ambitious woman in 1924 was not exactly an acceptable thing. And she had to accept this nomination as if it was just carrying forward her husband's intentions, fulfilling his progressive ideas.
She pursued several issues that were important to her. Those pertain to safety for minors, providing additional state loans to farmers because the agricultural depression was so severe, and reducing the number of hours that women were forced to work.
And when she was running for re-election, she said, I am not running on the gender card. I'm running on my record. She had Republican women who said, here you are, the first woman governor, and you didn't appoint very many women into positions of power in your administration. Why not? Why should we support you?
She lost by 1,300 votes. Her administrative abilities caught the attention of the FDR administration. FDR appointed her to direct the Mint, which she did for 20 years.
So you've elected a woman governor. Well, that was, almost 100 years ago. There are always the firsts of everything. There's always going to be a first woman elected to this, a first woman appointed to this. The challenge is having the second woman.
We started out great. We really did, with the legislative acts that gave women property rights, equal pay, civic participation, suffrage. First few years when women like Esther Morris were justice of the peace, and then women were serving on juries, and then kind of fizzled.
We have among the states with the lowest representation of women in the legislature. We have one of the worst wage gaps in the nation.
To be very honest with you, right now, the status of women in Wyoming, I don't feel very optimistic. But the great thing about America is never forever here. We always turn around. We always find a new way, a new path, new hope, new blood.
It certainly isn't that all is well in Wyoming because we have it written in the Constitution. We have a lot of work to do to live up to that. Now there's a majority of women on the Wyoming Supreme Court. Certainly when someone looks a little more like you, you have a feeling that you belong there. It's slow progress, but we're getting there.
We have so few voters that every vote is very critical. It really can make a huge difference.
When it comes to voting, I consider it a sacred duty. I will never not vote. I don't care how minor the election is or midterm elections, I will vote. I feel very keen on exercising my power, and I will do that every time.
Major funding for the State of Equality was provided by grants from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, Because Culture Matters, a program of the Wyoming Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources, culturaltrust.wyo.gov, and the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities. thinkwhy.org. And by the Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, the philanthropic arm of Rocky Mountain Power, supporting the growth and vitality of our communities. And the Homer A. and Mildred S. Scott Foundation, working to strengthen the lives of people who in turn make our community a great place to live. And by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment.
The State of Equality is available on DVD for $19.95. Order online at shop.wyomingpbs.org.